and final session of the day. This is response during COVID. Our colleague Graham Wood from Alaska DEC is going to moderate this session. So I'll invite Graham Wood to jump on the call here on the screen. And again, he'll be moderating the session in response during COVID-19. And with that, I'm handing it to you, Graham.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're in a much warmer place than I am here in Eagle River, Alaska. It's currently a balmy 7 degrees with freezing fog in the forecast this evening. So, we have two presenters, one from British Columbia and one from Alaska, to talk about active responses during COVID-19 and some of the challenges that were faced. First up is Kelly Malinoski. She's the Director of Emergency Management from Trans Mountain Corporation. Kelly has worked in the oil and gas industry in Canada for the past 20 years. Kelly is currently Director of Emergency Management at Trans Canada Corporation and is responsible for emergency preparedness and response for the Trans Mountain Pipeline and associated facilities. So with that, I will turn it back over to Kelly, and we'll try to answer questions afterwards and then move on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's hard. We're getting close to the end of the day of an all-day online meeting. I'm going to discuss today about our response during this global pandemic. I'm actually coming to you today from the city of Calgary in Alberta, where I call home and our head office is located. I have interesting lighting going on, so hopefully the sun doesn't come around that building again. I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, where I'm speaking to from today, which includes the Blackfoot Nation, tribes of Siksika, Kainai, Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation tribes of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge that the incident that I'll be speaking about occurred in Abbotsford, British Columbia, on the unceded traditional ancestral lands and shared territory of the Sumas First Nation and the Matsqui First Nation. These two First Nations are a part of the Stolo Nation. The Stolo people are known as the people of the river and have lived in the Fraser Valley since time immemorial. Next slide, please. I'll be speaking at a really high level on our incident timeline. I need to recognize that we're still responding out there to this day. And we've not completed our incident investigation and our review and learns on our incident response. So I'm very specifically going to be speaking about the COVID protocols in place at the time and any challenges we had with that, and the things that we learned along the way. If there are questions about more details on the incident, I'm not going to be able to answer those quite yet, but I do look forward to joining the conference circuit next year to talk about some of those things, because we're getting very close. Next slide, please. So at a very high level, the incident occurred in the very late minutes and the very wee early minutes of June 13th at our Sumas pump station in Abbotsford, British Columbia. We received an alarm into our Edmonton control center and immediately dispatched our crews to the site and shut in the station. We had an incident command post established in the region by approximately 10 a.m. and notifications were made to our local authority, which is the city of Abbotsford, our local Indigenous communities, and the provincial and federal regulators somewhere around 2 o'clock in the morning. The release was fully contained on Trans Mountain property. Those pictures that you see there are some of our first light pictures. That is not water that you see in those pictures. Next slide, please. Over the next several days, we were managing this incident from a hotel in Abbotsford, both with a virtual command post and some people there on site. I'm sorry, I've got something going on with my slide. Next slide, please. And the next slide. Here we go. Sorry about that. I will get this updated for the team. So site remediation continued on through to the 24th. Our initial emergency phase ended right between the 24th and the 26th of June, and then we moved into what we called our project phase, and that has continued on well into today. Next slide, please, and we're probably going to skip a couple. Around July 20th, there was a field adjacent to our facility, which is still owned by Trans Mountain. We've completed the excavation on that site right around July 20th and continued excavation within the facility location. Water quality monitoring continued throughout the entire area. At this point, the data was indicating that there was no harm to area drinking water. However, groundwater was impacted. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So fast forwarding to October 1st, we continued on through the next several months with excavation activities. We're working in close coordination with Stolo representatives and Sumas First Nation. Our remedial action plan is being developed during this time and has actually just gone out for comment in the last couple of days to our stakeholders. And starting October 1st is when we started our review and learn on our response. The incident investigation began on or about June 13th, but now we're starting to take a look at our response to see what we can learn. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the one thing that we found was that we were able to very easily adhere to our COVID-19 protection measures while responding to the emergency, both on site and while standing up an ICP, although both of those things looked very different. We had no COVID-19 cases or illnesses present itself during the Sumas pump station initial response. And to this day, as we do still have crews out there, we still do not have any cases associated with this site. Of note, this particular site is in a region of British Columbia where approximately 70% of their cases have originated from. So this has been quite a feat for us. Next slide. So COVID-19 initially came onto our corporate radar right in around January 15th when we were alerted to a couple of employees on vacation in Hubei province in China. So at that time, we dusted off our pandemic plans. We reviewed our processes, protocols over the next couple of months. Our emergency response plans were readied should this hit North America. Next slide, please. We developed a very specific response plan for COVID-19 out of our generic pandemic plan. It includes procedures for communication and awareness, all of our cleaning protocols, appropriate personal protective equipment, physical distancing requirements for site operations and construction, and interactions with our communities and landowners. Next slide, please. During the initial phases, our emergency response plan was stood up alongside our COVID response plan, then needed to be applied to what our emergency response plan had in place. Our site supervision and health and safety teams needed to incorporate those COVID-19 protocols into the existing response safety measures. We were also starting to respond in a time when the economy was starting to reopen. Some of the physical distancing and distancing requirements were starting to be relaxed. And Trans Mountain at the time was preparing for a return to our office space. We had been out for about 3 months and we were preparing to return. As most of you can appreciate, our emergency management teams wanted to all be responding to this spill. However, we had to split that team into two. We had to leave some people behind in order to continue with our corporate response. Next slide, please. When we activated the incident command post, we went virtual and physical. Due to size limitations of meeting spaces at the time, we needed to ensure that our physical incident command post only had the base number of people in there based on the directives at the time. Our critical incident management team remained in Calgary, and then our ICS staff, including Unified Command, was mobilized out to Abbotsford. The team's application was instrumental in being able to communicate through this, including to our field. At the time, our company was very early in implementing Microsoft Teams, so we were all learning how to use the platform and then responding at the same time. It's probably one of the only responses that I've been on where the liaison section was probably the largest section within the command post. Even our environmental unit was able to, by and large, operate remotely. Next slide, please. Under protecting people, our health and safety plan included the pandemic protocols. It was created for each site, both the pump station and the incident command post. A lot of people talked about this afterwards because there's a lot of camaraderie that can come out of a spill where people go to supper afterwards together. This was not something we were allowed to do. All responders were required to complete the COVID-19 self-declaration questionnaire. So we did have one of those in place. Next slide, please. I've talked a little bit about the numbers of people that were limited, both in the command post and the pump station. One of the things we needed to do at the pump station was bring in additional porta potties. We found very quickly that the bathrooms were a congregation point. So we actually brought in a number of porta potties and then assigned those porta potties per subcontractor or working area. So those were the areas you were to be. Next slide, please. Everybody arriving on site were receiving instructions about hygiene, transmission prevention protocols, PPE required, including the use of non-medical masks, which I'll get to again in a second here. Hand sanitizer, Lysol wipes were all available. All vehicles and manned equipment were sanitized before and at the end of each shift, and ensured it was sanitized between operators. At the time of this incident, the use of non-medical masks was not widely accepted, nor was it actually promoted by some of the health regions out there. So now when we're starting to go, it's causing a bit of an issue because as we're going back and remembering the things that we were doing at that time, we also have to remind ourselves about the protocols that were in place and the place we were at in the pandemic then. And how we might do things differently today because of new protocols in place. Next slide, please. So our key lessons that we learned very, very quickly were the longer that people are together, the more familiar they become with each other. And then the closer that they get physically to each other. We found that this can happen incredibly quickly, especially in cases where the workers are already familiar with each other or part of the same team. We saw this where workers were not as familiar with each other. We had groups coming into our command post from outside of Trans Mountain. Those people tended to stay apart anywhere between about 6 and 12 hours before we started to see that breakdown. But where workers were used to working in the same offices perhaps, or hadn't seen somebody in 3 months, but because of our now work at home policy, but they were very close before, often traveled together, worked together very closely. That breakdown of space happened sometimes in as little as 10 and 15 minutes. In order to combat some of that, we needed to ensure that we had a resource to monitor for those COVID protocols and ensure that continued compliance. So I think we were probably around day 2 or day 3 when we realized how quickly the physical distance was breaking down. Remembering at that time, mask use was not necessarily encouraged. Well, we had them available. The prevailing recommendations at the time, even within the province of British Columbia, was that masks were not helpful to prevent the spread. So that distance and the physical distance was very important at that time. So to have people coming together because they were familiar with each other was something we needed to be very concerned about. We did have resources deployed both in the field and into our command post whose sole responsibility was to monitor how far apart people were standing from each other. So that was pretty key for us. We're looking at that one as well as we move into what does our 2021 exercise schedule look like, and how are we going to take these lessons we learned during response and apply them in an exercising scenario. All of our larger scale exercises had already occurred for the year, or we postponed it for a year. So I appreciate the other presenters today and learning some of those things, but we definitely did learn the more people are around each other, the closer they're going to get to each other. And the more familiar you are with someone, the closer you'll get that much faster and that much sooner. And I believe that's all I have today. And I'm going to guess my last slide is the wrong one as well. I do apologize for this. I really do look forward to sharing our lessons learned in our response in more detail once we get through that process in 2021.
Great, thank you, Kelly. And Graham and Kelly from BC, I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. So unless anyone wants to throw a question in, I think we may be able to move on to the next presenter. So,
all right. Well, our next presenter in responses during COVID is Mike Day from Alyeska. Mike is the Emergency Preparedness and Response Operations Manager for Alyeska Pipeline Service Company and currently oversees tanker escorts and spill response for Prince William Sound and the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. He joined Alyeska in 1990 and has held a wide range of positions in pipeline and marine terminal operations and maintenance. Mike was born and raised in Valdez, and his first work was commercial fishing with his family, his children and relatives still earning a living from the waters of Alaska. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike and look forward to his presentation.
All right, thank you, Graham. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm joining you this afternoon from Valdez to go over the processes and lessons learned from an incident on the Valdez Marine Terminal on April 12th. If you're not familiar with Alyeska, it's a company created in the early 70s to build and operate the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system from Prudhoe Bay to the north slope to the Valdez Marine Terminal. It's currently owned by BP, ConocoPhillips, and Exxon, and BP shares in the process of sale right now. We also operate the tanker escort and spill response system in Prince William Sound on behalf of the tanker operators that ship oil through Prince William Sound. Terminal is a marine terminal at the southern terminus. It holds about 7 million barrels of storage, has 2 marine loading berths and vapor control system. At its peak in the late 80s, we moved about 2 million barrels a day and had about 900 ships a year. Currently, that's about 500,000 barrels a day and about 280 ships each year. Throughout the history of Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, it's moved about 18 billion barrels of oil and 22,000 tanker transits, a little over that. Most of those tankers actually run to the west coast of the US, and every once in a while one goes to Hawaii as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to put a little context to my presentation. I'll take you back, try to take you back to March, which seems like years ago to me, but things do change pretty quickly. In March of this year, we started to screen travelers, had a public health declaration emergency by the governor. We officially began working remotely on March 17th, our entire office staff. We stood up an incident management team as well. Most of the work of that incident management team was around making sure we had good inventory of our PPE, making sure we had good procedures for people to work at our operating facilities, primarily pump stations and the marine terminal in close proximity to each other. We have a lot of shift workers in those, so we had to prepare business travel plans. and then got a bit of a wake-up call when the first positive COVID case occurred on the North Slope, not in an Alyeska facility. But by that time, most of the office staff was working remotely, but we had a pretty good plan in place for how we were going to manage things, which served us well during this response. We knew where our PPE was at. We had evacuation points lined out. We had policies and procedures in place, and had an incident management team set up to handle those things. So I was a part of that incident management team. We disbanded that early in April, and then on April 12th, started to manage this response. A couple other things for context. As a business, around this time frame, we had, as we started to work remotely, we had just begun to implement Microsoft Teams. But before that, like a lot of other people, we used Skype, we used WebEx, we used a number of different things kind of mixed together to accomplish our business. So Teams really wasn't something that we had looked at for this, and we kind of went back to old reliable. Next slide. So I put my presentation kind of in terms of themes and things to do to be prepared for a response that I think served us well. And I'll talk a little bit about preparing and the practice that we do to do that. So most oil spill response organizations combine their equipment and field personnel training with their preventive maintenance programs and how they do their work. So there's a lot of discussion about this at times among spill response organizations, whether they should be separate. There's a lot of reasons to keep them separate, but we don't. We combine our preventive maintenance program and the hands-on work that technicians and spill responders do to operate this equipment, to maintain it, to implement the tactics that the spill response requires, and we combine that into our preventive maintenance programs. So these folks see this stuff frequently when they do maintenance. We also do tactical training exercises as well. But I would say that doing this practice for 20 years was a good contributing factor to having a lot of people available to run a wide range of the equipment that we used in the response. Also teaches folks to work together. When you do that preventive maintenance work, you'll work with different crews or different folks. So it also teaches people to be flexible and to learn from each other while they're doing that. So we saw that in practice in this exercise, so I wanted to highlight that, even though it wasn't not really a command post item. Another prepare and practice element, which we've talked about a lot today, is around just periodic exercises, ensuring that when you do field deployments that you try to include some element of an incident management team integration and communication. Another lesson that I'd offer is there's good reasons to have large exercises with a lot of people to test communication, but there's also, a pretty good argument to have small exercises as well. Those, force people, in my experience, to step outside their normal day-to-day role or what they train for or what their focus is in a large exercise. And you really have to look at the whole instead of just the parts. And I think small exercises allow us to do that. And I think they also benefited us in this response as well. Lastly, prepare and practice. In addition to just the normal IMT training and incident management handbooks, in our organization we have a procedure for how we manage an incident management team. It lays out meetings, meeting attendees, draft agendas, who sits where, and we practice that. We train on that in each one of these larger exercises, but we also make sure that we have a bench on the team to implement those things. Our response is a little bit customized. I'll refer to it a little bit, and some folks already have. We use the response group's IAP software. It provides a lot of these tools to you. As you know, a lot of incident management handbooks have this information as well. But by having our own standalone procedure that our contingency planning group maintains, we do a couple of things. We make sure we stay in compliance with the plan, and we're doing what our contingency plans say we're required to do. And it also lets it tailor it to us, so that somebody doesn't have to learn really IMT speak and be a 300 level to set up a meeting room and make that productive for the folks that need to do that. We also have a lot of checklists in our contingency plans. They're helpful to make sure that we follow all the right steps, do all the things that we need to do, make it so a person can step into a position with a minimal amount of training, and they pull those right out of the contingency plan. Checklists, one caution there, checklists usually guide different people to a similar result. So make sure it's a good checklist if you're using checklists. Next slide. Facilities. In the Alyeska world, we have a number of different command centers scattered throughout the operation, on the pipeline, at the terminal, and here at the Ship Escort Response Vessel System facility in Valdez. So that's our Emergency Operations Center. So out of those 4 dedicated facilities along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, the VIOC, which is where I work, is probably the best, the most equipped out of all those, but certainly a dedicated facility that's set up that really doesn't do anything except for act as our command post to respond to oil spills, made a huge difference for us. Obviously a pretty experienced group in the meeting here today, but I've gone to lots of other events, as I'm sure most people have. You know, hotels and convention centers make good places as well. A lot of different breakout rooms. I've gone to a lot of remote camp facilities. You know, smaller pump stations are probably a little bit more challenged, but at least in my experience in Alaska, most of the camps on the North Slope, the living accommodations for folks, have big meeting rooms, common areas, cafeterias, things like that. Another thing that we have built into the Valdez Emergency Operations Center is segregated sections. A lot of these other larger events that I've been to and other places that aren't a dedicated command post, that are a hotel or a convention center, I thought that, you know, there's been times we've handmade dividers to put between sections when we needed to, when we set up for an exercise. But if I ever had to do one of these, that's probably one of the first things that I would go do. If it's not in your checklist for setting up a remote command post, you can add, you know, Pottery Barn or Bed Bath & Beyond or wherever your local room divider store might be, and work on those. Another thing that was a big challenge for us was food service during this event. Valdez is a community of about 4,000 people at the end of a road. And we have a cafeteria facility at the terminal, but due to COVID concerns, we had shut it down and run it out of food about 3 weeks before this incident occurred. As this incident ramped up, we were already having shortages at the local grocery stores. There's only 2 grocery stores in Valdez to serve the community. And one of the big concerns that I had, I was the incident commander for this event, was that we made sure we fed our teams, but also that we didn't create more stress in a community that was already seeing more stress than it was healthy for it to see. So food service for us, the first couple weeks was a big challenge. We did what we could locally. We shipped equipment and supplies in from out of town. We reopened the cafeteria at the terminal just to provide food for the responders and the incident management team, because we didn't want, you know, we wanted control of those items, didn't want people taking breaks and leaving the facility or anything like that. So that was another way that we helped manage our COVID issues, as well as bring people together. I guess the other thing I'd point out about that is it really made me pay attention to the things that really matter in a response. First off is the people, and an army marches on its stomach, and making sure that that was one thing that they didn't have to worry about at all, so that that wasn't a distraction to them, and that they didn't have to worry about that. But really, in a small response, which for us, this was a relatively small response compared to what we're prepared to do, setting up logistics, identifying resources, and managing the plan to deliver those to the right place at the right time are really the things that require a great deal of attention to support the field operations. If you don't have that, then you're behind from the time you start. You know, we've already discussed some other areas. Denise talked about the medical facilities that were available during this incident, and if we were to have anything go wrong. You know, there's a few beds here in the local community, but really had to manage segregation of people, both in the response and in the incident management team, and ensuring PPE compliance, and making sure that we had those things ready and available for people and available for them to use. Next slide. Communication. So you might imagine communication is still an issue, and it's probably the same issue. I found generally that since people, when you can't read somebody's body language, it's my experience that it kind of back to the previous presentation, it does a couple of bad things. It forces people to get closer to each other, so you have to guard against that. But it really forces people to explain what their assumptions are. You can get a lot of visual cues from people from that body language, and when you don't have it, you have to communicate more. And we certainly saw that during this incident. So really, you know, people's understanding might actually be enhanced by the ability to really get close to people and talk. We, as I said, use the IAP software. We provided access into that system for several stakeholders and regulatory personnel. We limited some of the things that were visible, but we did provide them access into the IAP software so that they didn't have to come to the command post to get all their updates and information that they were looking for. That improved communication. We have with our systems, whether they're communication systems, engineering, work management, safety management systems, we have really good access into those systems for our employees to work remotely. So as we went through this incident, verifying that we had really good source control was problematic for us in the first few days for a couple of reasons. Number one, it snowed 2 feet the night of the incident. And this was a spill that originally went to land and migrated its way into water. And it did that completely underground. There was no demonstrable surface flow of any oil to the water. And so our engineering folks were able to look up drawings, old surveys, things like that, and really pinpoint where this flow was coming from as it made its way to the water. So again, to the extent that you can get your employees and personnel access, not just to the communication systems, but documents, work management, things like that, that was a big benefit for us to this incident. Joint Information Center, we ran that remotely. Denise referred to that somewhat. That was done all remotely with regulatory personnel from federal and state agencies, as well as Alyeska taking part in that. We did have 2 members of the Unified Command in the command post in Valdez, so only had to go into the virtual world for one approval, which enhanced that process as well. One thing that we did during the event that I think paid dividends and offer it to you to try and perhaps include in one of your incidents in the future, or a spill an exercise. We did a practice press conference. Again, at the time, the tools weren't as advanced as they are now, but we just practiced briefing the unified command, briefed up a couple of mock reporters, put folks in staging areas and practice having folks wait in lobbies. Had a few antagonizers in the group, so practice how we would shut that down or control that if needed during the press conference. So something to add perhaps for objectives for your virtual exercise at some point is a practice press conference. I thought it was worth doing and went pretty well. Kind of a strong point for external sharing was the wildlife working team. Wildlife was a pretty significant element of this response. It had its own set of meetings, discussions. We set up an external SharePoint site for those folks to share permits, reports, sightings, and things like that. We're pretty good at that as a company. We use an external SharePoint site to set up our contracts, RFPs, requests for proposals for outside vendors. So we have quite a bit of experience at setting those up quickly and well and providing good access to folks through those. So next slide. So this is just an example of what you'd look like if you logged into that, example of what we put there for the trustee agencies and folks to look at. I guess on another thing I'd add from a personal note, I mentioned that wildlife was a pretty significant element of this. I've lived in Valdez and in Alaska all my life, and it was striking to me, and I've lived on the water a good part of my life. It was really striking to me as this incident unfolded. You know, during the first few days, this was springtime in Alaska, and during the first few days, there was, you know, kind of what I would call the normal amount of birds, whether they were kittiwakes or gulls or whatever birds fly through this area in the springtime. I'm not a birder, so forgive me. But what happened in the course of a week or 10 days was just an absolute explosion of the bird population, and they all nest and rest on our berths, which have quarter-mile long catwalks out into the port. Really was eye-opening to me how dynamic of an environment it was. So we put a lot of effort into that and a lot of work. But I just wanted to offer that. It was just amazing to me to watch Mother Nature work in just a few days. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about process. Of course, you know, we followed the incident command system and structure. It's really our key to being consistent. I talked about our procedure and the practice that we put into that. We typically, in any kind of an incident, will ramp up a relatively full incident management team and scale back from that when we need to. So again, our bias as an organization is to ramp up a lot and scale back, because that's it's a lot more difficult to ramp up and be behind. So that's our general practice. As an experience, I'd offer that our planning periods during this event changed pretty easily. We started with 24 hours, then we went to 3 days, and then in the end, our planning period for the cycle of meetings went to 7 days. So again, ramped up quick, had a lot of focus in the beginning, and then as things came more under control, ramped away from that. Our biggest issue really with the IAP software, with communication, was around the meeting schedule management related to the planning cycle. So as we went through each day, had a couple of different adjustments as is normal, I think, to the meeting schedule. We're used to all those folks being in a command post. You can make an announcement over the public address system and everybody knows what's going on. But when all those folks are remote, not always sitting at their desk looking at a computer to see what those things are, managing our meeting schedule became a big issue for us. I think some more modern tools, I think, have addressed some of those issues. But in the IAP software, it's basically just a spreadsheet that you type a schedule into and you publish. So look forward to some better tools to manage that in the future. Another thing that we do that I think is a best practice, certainly has helped us, is that we have our documentation unit, even after the initial response, update and maintain the 201 in the IAP software. So we take we have a person in the documentation unit who goes through the unit logs that are submitted at the end of each shift. They also review the operations and situation briefing and updates, and they'll enter appropriate information from those into the unit log. And that's one of the things that we shared through the IAP software with outside agencies. So they could basically have a running log by time of significant events or reports that took place during the response. Saved a lot of meeting management time with repeating information and things like that when folks could just go to that at the end. Our primary tool for our meetings and briefings was WebEx. That was our company tool at the time. A couple of lessons learned there. If you're using WebEx or really any tool, again, these things have gotten a lot better recently, but a way to monitor who is online is helpful. A way to mute everybody is helpful. We figured some of those things out the hard way. Make sure the meeting doesn't expire after a week. And that's kind of related to this suggestion. One of the things that we found useful was to have one call-in number and access code for meetings. So we basically kept an open WebEx teleconference line for 3 to 4 weeks. We didn't conduct all the meetings on it, but we conducted all the shift briefings on it, all the turnover meetings, our operations updates that we did every hour or two. I'm confident that some folks never signed off of that, and they just stayed logged into that during the whole incident. So I'd consider that a best practice. There's some negatives to that as well, but I think the positives outweigh those. Another area for improvement with us was in the staging areas. Our equipment was pretty challenging to track remotely. We did a good job with people. That wasn't too much of an issue. And some of that has to do with how our response is designed. We really design our system to send out everything at first and ask questions later. And we have a lot of stuff. And so that takes a lot of cleanup and takes a lot of catching up. Don't know an easy way around that, but that was a challenge for us, and we're looking for ways to handle that and do that better. Next slide. So lastly, I'll end with relationships. So for Alyeska, our incident management team is assembled throughout Alaska and beyond. Our team is all internal to Alyeska, so it's all Alyeska employees and direct contractors. But we exercise together. Like most people, we have managed, small parts of exercises remotely before, and that practice and those relationships served us well. Factor in travel restrictions or any other restrictions into contingencies. I like to tell my team and my folks that, all these limits that we got from COVID are really no different than any other restriction that we've ever had, other than the consequences are probably different, right? Certainly for personnel and for the people. But we really have to have contingencies for weather or for anything else, and still be able to respond like the experts that we are, and do our job well. I'd ask my team to think about what those things are, even if COVID had never had never come along. Certainly something that we should have at least a notion of how we'd address that would be. Another thing is just around delegation in the command post. If there are representatives in the command post that folks who are operating remotely are able to delegate to, then that certainly helps move information through the system, through the process, and get information to stakeholders, to the public, and to the field faster. So to the ability that you can delegate, that will serve the response well, and appreciate whatever efforts folks make to make that happen. And then lastly, my last point or conclusion or emphasis is just trust. You know, the time to build trust is when things are calm, and the time to reinforce that is when those things aren't so calm. Like many of the conversations you've heard here today, you know, there was a lot of uncertainty in the early April timeframe, certainly, and we asked stakeholders to stay away from the command post if possible. We asked them to stay away from the field operation if possible, and for lots of reasons, you know, those requests were honored, and want to express appreciation for that. And I know that one of the reasons for that was trust. Certainly in Valdez, and I think this whole community of people that are involved in this work is really not a large community. And appreciate the opportunity to communicate today and share our experiences. And really, I think that I know that as the incident commander for this incident, I felt trusted by the community in Valdez of stakeholders and regulators, and hope that we earned that trust during this response. You know, so I would just offer that probably as much as a good communication tool and a video and the ability to see people and look them in the eye, you know, I think that trust plays a big part in that, and planning for the future as we go into this virtual world. Is everybody still there?
Yeah.
You still got me?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So as you go into that virtual world, you know, don't forget, I can't imagine being somebody new to my organization or new to any part of this group of people and not having some personal connections already. And so as you plan your exercises for this year, as you plan this virtual world, encourage that. It's all valuable, it's all great, but don't forget to plan some time, however it works best for you, to build some relationships and have some personal time and you know, feel the pain together in a productive way, because I think that pays as big a dividends as anything else. And that is all I have. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And Graham, do you want to wrap up the session?
No, I want to thank both presenters. That both presentations were very insightful. I definitely want to add on to what Mike said about building relationships with the industry and regulators and you know, community partners, especially in a place like Valdez where the community is tight knit to begin with, and so that way when something does happen, you know, everybody's working towards a greater good. I think that your words were feel the pain together in a good way, and that's how it has to happen. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. And we don't have any questions at this time for Mike. So with that, we will wrap up the session. And I want to